You're listening to a CNA podcast. Hi guys, Teresa Tang here. We have all been there, starting a new job, getting those first day jitters. 4 months after William Lai's victory, he will be sworn in as Taiwan's next president in just a few days. His ruling Democratic Progressive Party will assume a historic third term in power on the island.
我们一起走到了这里，谢谢你们用
Mr. Lai there in his victory speech on January 13th, saying the people of Taiwan walked together to get to this point in history. He's got a lot on his plate. He says so himself.
Even as we stand at the forefront of defending our values against authoritarianism, we are determined to safeguard peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. While aspiring for peace, we harbor no illusions.
Beijing will be watching Mr. Lai closely, having labeled him a dangerous separatist. So how will his presidency play out? Victoria Jen is in Taipei and Olivia Siong joins me from Beijing. Hi ladies, good to see you both today.
Hello.
Glad to be here.
So Mr. Lai, he won the election 4 months ago now, and I'm wondering what has sentiment among people in Taiwan been since then? How much anticipation is there for this inauguration, Vic?
Well, since William Lai's January victory, he hasn't really had much time to celebrate. In fact, he has been traveling around the island trying to reassure the public that he is going to maintain peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. Why? Because he is trying to water down his hardline pro-independence position. Now, remember, back in 2017, when he was still premier, he called himself a pragmatic worker for Taiwan independence. Now that he is going to become the president, it raised the concern that he might push for Taiwan's independence, which could lead to a war between the two sides. And so to pacify that fear, he has been traveling around and trying to reassure the public that he wants to maintain the status quo and also that he wants to follow the footstep of President Tsai Ing-wen on her China policy so that there will be no surprises in cross-strait relations. But of course, actions are louder than words. So the public is right now watching very closely what he has to do, what matches what he has to say.
Ollie, you've been watching all this play out from China, and officials there have had more than 100 days now to digest that Mr. Lai has won. Beijing has already described him as a troublemaker. What does that bode for cross-strait relations?
Well, Teresa, I think continuity is the keyword here, Teresa. Under 8 years of DPP rule, when Tsai Ing-wen came to power, ties have deteriorated between Beijing and Taipei, so it was already expected that these cross-strait relations would remain tense prior to the election, and with the result, perhaps even get more tense. And perhaps the signal is that this heightened level of pressure from Beijing is going to be the norm moving forward with the DPP and William Lai in power. And during the campaign period, I remember that Beijing did not explicitly state who its preferred candidate was, but it was quite clear that it did not want to see William Lai at the helm. It labeled him a dangerous separatist, a destroyer of peace, framing this election as a choice between peace and war, prosperity and decline. Vic mentioned that reference in 2017 by Lai that he was a worker for Taiwanese independence. That has been cited by Beijing as well. But it was a little bit surprising, perhaps, to some observers when the results came out that Beijing kind of played down the result. Its response to some was seen as relatively muted. Mainland officials chose to focus on how William Lai won without a majority vote and how the DPP lost its majority in the legislature, saying that the party could not represent mainstream public opinion in Taiwan. And an analyst I remember speaking to told me that this was about playing down the impact that this result would have on Beijing's long-term goal, which has been articulated many times by Chinese leaders, including the top leader, President Xi Jinping. He's saying that, reunification is inevitable and is the essence of achieving the country's goal of national rejuvenation. Even though they've talked about doing this peacefully, we know that China has not ruled out the use of force to bring Taiwan under its control. And in the last few months, we have seen China step up its carrot and sticks approach while trying to increase economic and tourism incentives. It's also intensified military pressure by flying its aircraft near the island, its coast guards conducting patrols in the waters. And we saw tensions flare recently after 2 Chinese fishermen died in Taiwan-controlled waters near Kinmen Island after being pursued by Taiwanese Coast Guard. So analysts tell me that perhaps this pressure is Beijing trying to get William Lai and his party to accept something that's as close to the 1992 consensus as possible, and to be able to articulate that 1992 consensus often talked about, basically referring to this understanding reached in the past by Beijing and the Kuomintang that the two sides, in order to continue talks, they must recognize that there is only one China, but each side can have its own interpretation of what that means. But we know that William Lai has refused to acknowledge that, which Beijing sees as the baseline for engagement. So these tensions expected to remain.
So that's the reaction from authorities. But what about regular Chinese people? How do they feel about William Lai and cross-strait ties? Do they even care?
Well, we were on standby when the election was taking place in Taiwan. And, it was in the headlines of all international media talking about how this is a high-stakes election. But here in Beijing and on the mainland, there was very little coverage of it on the day itself. In Chinese state media and in local media itself, they only started reporting on the event in the night after it became clear that William Lai had won. Then the news shot to the top of the trending list on Chinese social media platform Weibo, although the comments were restricted, which points to the sensitivity of the issue here on the mainland. And I remember going out to speak to people here in Beijing, and actually quite a few said that they hadn't been following developments. They said, life still has to go on. And there were also mixed views among those we spoke to from different walks of life. Have a listen.
It feels like we will see reunification very soon. William Lai is a very typical Taiwan independent separatist. After he takes the helm, it feels like cross-strait ties may not be so friendly. Then maybe the country will take some measures.
Hong Kong has returned to China, and I don't know what to say about Taiwan, but I think it's best to reunify. But if not, it also may not have much impact on us personally. We still must live our lives.
So I do think that people do have strong views about Taiwan, and you do hear people talking about how perhaps Beijing should take a more hardline approach when it comes to reunification. But whether or not this is rhetoric or authorities and media using nationalism to kind of play up the issue is something that needs to continue to be monitored, and something that observers say Beijing would likely want to calibrate carefully, because it could get out of hand if this nationalism factor is played up too much.
今天早上发生在花莲瑞士规模7.2的强震。
You just heard Mr. Lai speaking at a press conference in Hualien County shortly after a deadly quake struck the region early last month. Hualien is actually an opposition stronghold, and some say that tremor was an early test for the incoming leader. What do you think, Vic? How did he handle the crisis?
Well, it was clearly an early test for William Lai's leadership, and so far he has proved himself well. Even though he's vice president, he took the lead in managing the search and rescue mission throughout the entire earthquake. And also, he was the first to rush to Hualien, where the earthquake was the hardest hit. And his presence there and also his pledge to the people in Hualien had gained him a lot of support. And he has also demonstrated a lot of charisma and poise while handling a big crisis like that. And so that was definitely a big plus for him.
So we know he has been traveling around Taiwan. Mr. Lai also announcing his cabinet last month. Were you surprised at his picks? Do they tell us anything about how closely he's going to follow his predecessor, Tsai Ing-wen's policies?
Actually, there hasn't been that much surprise in the choice of his cabinet members because many of them are actually familiar faces. For example, Foreign Minister Joseph Wu, he is going to be taking on the position as National Security Council Secretary General. And the incumbent Secretary General, Wellington Koo, he is going to take the position as Defense Minister. And for other key positions, such as Foreign Minister as well as Mainland Affairs Council ministers, they're all incumbent cabinet members. So basically, it goes to show that William Lai is going to follow President Tsai Ing-wen's administration and her policies and to avoid any dramatic changes in his first term. And that also puts at ease for many people that things are going to be the same despite his hardline pro-independence position. Now, let's take a listen at what he had to say.
Maintaining peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait is an important mission for my presidency. I will follow the Constitution of the Republic of China, neither be humble nor arrogant, and maintain the status quo. I will replace containment with exchanges and confrontation with dialogue. I will confidently cooperate with China to enhance the well-being of the people on both sides of the strait and achieve peace and common prosperity. However, in the face of China's threat, I'm determined to protect Taiwan.
Here's the thing, though. His party, the DPP, doesn't have a majority in parliament. So how is Mr. Lai's administration going to push through its policies?
Well, it's definitely not going to be easy for the DPP to be facing a hung parliament. And so there is expected to be a lot of negotiations and compromises. And so far, we know that the opposition KMT and Taiwan People's Party, they're working together closely on many issues, and that is going to make it very difficult for the DPP. So based on what we heard so far is that the DPP is planning to propose more domestic legislations so that would help the general public. And so that it's going to make it harder for the opposition to reject or to boycott.
Okay. So then on cross-strait relations then, how far, Vic, do you think Mr. Lai will push the envelope as compared to his predecessor, Ms. Tsai Ing-wen?
Well, like I mentioned earlier, William Lai is going to tone down his hardline pro-independence position, at least at the start of his term. And given the heightened tensions across the Taiwan Strait, the chances of him pushing the envelope is likely to be slim. And on top of that, it's also very important that the U.S. Would not want to see any changes in the status quo. And also at the same time that the U.S. does not want to see any unilateral changes or unilateral provocations from Taiwan to tip the balance between the two sides.
I'm actually really interested in the Xiao factor in all of this. Taiwan's Vice President-elect Xiao Bi-khim has been popular in Washington since 2020. She was Taiwan's special envoy. She speaks fluent English. She has deep ties to American officials and scholars, and she has been blacklisted, sanctioned twice by China for, quote, colluding with the U.S. Olivia, how significant is Xiao going to be as VP?
Well, Teresa, I think Xiao's recent trip, even though she said it was in a private capacity to the U.S., did anger Beijing. Although observers say that it was a trip that was comparatively more low profile compared to when William Lai visited the U.S. when he was VP-elect. And the mainland's response has not been as strong as perhaps when we compare that to then U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan when those unprecedented large military drills were launched around the island back in 2022. And that sent China-U.S. relations and cross-strait relations into this tailspin. Beijing also seeing Xiao as playing a part in helping to facilitate that visit back then and those sanctions that you talk about. But end of the day, this is a known duel between Lai and Xiao for Beijing. They are seeing it as their position is unlikely to change, that they are pro-independence leaning, even though Vic talked about Lai wanting to play down that, at least at the start. But I think another factor that we have to think about with Beijing's response is that it also does not want to act too strongly and risk affecting progress it has made in improving China-US relations. Taiwan seen as a key part of that bilateral relationship as well. Beijing also likely waiting to see what happens with the US presidential election. If the current US president, Joe Biden, is elected again, that could mean more of the current policies and engagement that we've been seeing. But if Trump comes back to power, that could be a wild card on how high Taiwan is on his priority list. But regardless, as China has repeatedly told the US that Taiwan is its number one red line. So to Beijing, Taiwan is a domestic issue and will continually repeat that to countries and governments who have interactions with Taiwan officials. And the other factor to consider for Beijing is that if the issue of Taiwan escalates or there is conflict, then this isn't going to be a domestic issue. It's likely to draw in other countries like the US or Japan. So the Xiao factor, I think they're seen more of as a duo and an overall party stance that Beijing will have to deal with.
I want to talk about the main opposition party in Taiwan, Kuomintang, or KMT. They have been pretty busy. On April the 10th, former Taiwanese President Ma Ying-jeou met Chinese President Xi Jinping in Beijing. And then less than a month after that, the KMT sent 17 sitting legislators to China as an icebreaker of sorts. Help us make sense of these moves, Olivia. What is the KMT's goal with China?
Well, I think Ma Ying-jeou making this visit is interesting because of where he stands now and the positions that he holds, which actually he doesn't hold a position. He is a former Taiwan president, former leader of the KMT, which is typically friendlier to Beijing. But he is still influential within the party that is seen to be more friendly to the mainland. So we saw Ma Ying-jeou describing his visit to the mainland as a journey of peace, that this was a personal visit. But it's very clear that this visit was steeped in symbolism. He met Chinese President Xi Jinping for the first time since that historic meeting, which Vic covered in 2015 in Singapore. Also historic since it's the first time a mainland leader is receiving a sitting of former Taiwanese leader. And perhaps it's a signal that we should be looking out from Beijing that is trying to send to the DPP and William Lai just a month or so before his inauguration that's more important here. President Xi, when he met Ma Ying-jeou, addressed the former leader as Mr. Ma, taking effort not to endorse the leadership of the Self-Ruled Island, even though they were all smiles. President Xi also emphasizing that they are compatriots and are Chinese and there are no forces that can separate them, and that foreign interference cannot stop the historic trend of a, quote, family reunion, even as he talked about peaceful reunification. And so this coming amid the context of what we have seen in the last few years under the DPP, increased military pressure, tensions, and how skepticism over how Beijing may act, we have to note that also that Beijing had cut off dialogue with Taiwan authorities since the DPP came to power. But this visit and meeting with Ma Ying-jeou representing the KMT, analysts say perhaps Beijing trying to convey that to the DPP that dialogue is possible, but that has to be on the basis of the 1992 consensus. And so Ma Ying-jeou quoted also as saying when returning to Taiwan that even though the political systems may differ from the mainland, that all are descendants of the Yellow Emperor belonging to the same Chinese nation, calling on young people to set aside ideological differences, which he said there are these ties that cannot be severed by politics.
Let's look ahead to November and the U.S. election. One of the biggest tests for Mr. Lai could come in the form of Mr. Trump, right, Vic? The former president recently made comments that sounded like a threat to pull U.S. troops out of South Korea. How much can Taiwan depend on the U.S.'s defense commitments? What is Mr. Lai going to do to make sure that America is there for them?
Taiwan received a record number of arms deals from under the Trump administration, and it continues to receive strong backings from the Biden administration. Now, under Taiwan Relations Act, the U.S. is obligated to provide defensive weapons to Taiwan to counter any military threat from China. And such support is likely to continue no matter who wins the election. But other commitments remains unclear, such as whether or not the U.S. would come to Taiwan's aid if Taiwan comes under the attack of China. Now, if Trump wins the election, now there's going to be more uncertainties for sure, because unlike Biden, Trump has declined to say whether or not the U.S. is going to come to Taiwan's aid if China attacks Taiwan. And also on top of that, he has criticized Taiwan for taking chip businesses from the United States. And given the fact that he campaigns on America first, observers are saying that there's a good chance that he's going to put Taiwan's issue on the back burner. So under the circumstances, observers are saying that Taiwan may not get the kind of support that Taiwan hopes to get if the Trump wins the election.
That's interesting. We'll have to watch that. Okay, so what can we expect post-inauguration? Mr. Lai is going to be president for the next 4 years. Olivia, do you expect to see any immediate moves from Beijing? Is there anything that could potentially trigger China to be more aggressive?
Well, there was this analogy that was used to describe this to me, that cross-strait tensions now are, just bubbling. And they will continue to bubble, and that is going to be the new normal. Perhaps the heat will be turned up at certain times as Beijing is going to continue to likely pressure Taiwan with the DPP administration. The military has put out statements that it will crush any Taiwan independence forces, but the question is whether tensions will boil over and bubble over into a full-on conflict, or will Beijing move to bring Taiwan back under its control? But observers I've spoken to are of the consensus that this is quite unlikely to happen in the near future, at least. A lot of attention had been paid to China's military budget. It maintained an increase this year of 7.2%. But this is perhaps more of China trying to turn its military into overall world-class fighting force by mid-century, which is a goal that has been set by President Xi, because we have to remember, in the larger picture, besides Taiwan, China also has other security issues that it has to address. There are other potential flashpoints, like the South China Sea or what's happening in the Korean Peninsula. Also, it's unlikely that China will want to risk any sort of international repercussions by acting on Taiwan at this point, because it also has challenges it's facing, like its economy to worry about. The big question, though, is how patient Beijing is going to be before it chooses to act. It has put options on the table for Taiwan to be brought under the one country, two systems model like Hong Kong. But we have to note that this is something that all Taiwanese parties, including the KMT, have rejected. So right now, there seems to be no practical options on the table as to how Beijing may act.
Taiwan has formal diplomatic relations with only 12 countries in the world. Vic, before we go, do you expect to see Beijing continue to chip away at that, maybe ramp up its drive to get Taiwan to lose its last few diplomatic allies? What do you think?
Yes, China is definitely going to try to win over more of Taiwan's diplomatic allies. We know that Pacific Island Nauru just cut ties with Taiwan only 2 days after William Lai won presidency. So that was a clear warning to William Lai from Beijing. And so we can expect the war on diplomacy continues in his coming term. Now, Taiwan, of course, is on a seemingly losing end because it can't compete with the economic incentives that China has to offer. So now the only thing that Taiwan can count on is the U.S. support. The U.S. plays a very important role in helping Taiwan to maintain its diplomatic allies. Palau, for instance, is a good example because Palau is one of the 3 freely associated states, which allows the U.S. exclusive military access in exchange for financial and other assistance. And so I recently visited Palau and I spoke to the country's president, and he tells me that China has actually offered to fill all the hotel rooms in Palau if Palau is willing to cut ties with Taiwan.
Oh, wow.
But of course, Palau declined. And he said the main reason for Palau to not accept such attractive economic incentives is mainly because of its agreement with the U.S., that the U.S. has promised to provide military and financial aid to the country. So given under the circumstances, even though that Taiwan may continue to lose its diplomatic allies, but the chances of the number going down to zero is slim because it would really depend on the U.S. attitude, and the chances of the U.S. allowing that to go down to zero is very slim.
Well, the countdown is on to Inauguration Day and to what is sure to be a dynamic next chapter for Taiwan. Thank you so much, Olivia and Vic, for your insights today.
Thanks, Teresa.
Thank you.
And a reminder that the TV episodes of CNA Correspondent air every Wednesday at 9:30 p.m. Singapore, Hong Kong time. And also find reports from Olivia and Vic on YouTube, as well as on CNA.Asia. The team behind this week's episode is Saya Win, Clara Ong, Crispina Robert, Craig Dale, and myself, Teresa Tang. Thanks for joining us this week.